Welcome to History 489. This is Senior Seminar in History, and this is Week 1. A note on photo sources in this PowerPoint. All photo sources used in the PowerPoint are copyright-free Google images and/or clip art unless otherwise marked. A disclaimer. Online classes, because of their very nature, are demanding. They require a great deal of self-discipline and self-motivation. Because we are not meeting in a face-to-face format, that means that we need to leave the lines of communication open in other ways. I absolutely love teaching. I've won several major teaching awards, including one for the entire Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky region. So I am here to help you if you have any questions or concerns whatsoever. Always feel free to email me at my NKU email address. I check email messages fanatically, probably every half an hour to an hour, unless something is really up in my life, some emergency. Or feel free to call my cell phone, which is listed there, between 9 and 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. And you can expect that I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Please do not text message. I do not text message with students. It's not part of my cell phone contract. Now, it's very important in any class, but certainly in an online class, to go ahead and read the syllabus so that you get an overview of where your points are going to lie. There are 820 points in this class, but actually, as the Blackboard system sees it, there's really only 800 points. So the Blackboard system doesn't understand my system. So if there's ever a question about, what your grade is at any particular point in time, pardon the pun, point in time, you can get a hold of me and I will explain things to you. But basically, to get like an A++, to be perfect in this class, you would need an 800. But I throw in 20 extra points. That's what I call self-service extra credit. I do not give any other extra credit. That is the self-serve extra credit. And basically, it's the icebreaker. So you want to make certain that you do the icebreaker of 20 points. It's really easy. And, it certainly sets you up for, having hopefully a good semester and getting to know all of your classmates as well. There are 3 discussions worth 100 points each. Those are all explained in the syllabus, and as we get closer to that, if you have any questions, please let me know. There's also an annotated bibliography. We'll be talking a little bit about that today, as well as an essay of 300 points, and a resume and a cover letter worth 100 points, and then you see the breakdown given there. Now, at the end of the syllabus, there's a really fantastic bibliography. Pardon me for being so modest, but these are kind of some of the major books on historiography. And historiography is one of the things that we'll be looking at this semester, in addition to a bunch of other things. And some of these are in our library and some are not. The one that I ordered for our library and that we have and very few universities in the United States have is this last one by Daniel Wolfe called The Oxford History of Historical Writing in 5 volumes. NKU has all 5 volumes. I thank our library for getting them all in as I requested. We start this class out, many of my other classes in history, talking a little bit about history itself. And I'd like to refer to this. It was really kind of a neat little movie called 50 First Dates back in 2004. And it starred Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler. And Drew Barrymore played a person who had, a loss of memory for the prior 24 hours of her life. And very interesting movie because, she doesn't remember the day that just happened before hers because she has this special form of amnesia. And so when she meets Adam Sandler, it literally is every day is kind of a new date for her. Well, imagine how important memory is to each and every one of us in our lives. How we could barely operate, if we couldn't daily remember how to do things and all of the lessons we've learned over the years. Well, David Kivig and Myron Marty, in a book in Public History, have perhaps said it better than anyone. Social memory serves both society and individuals, as personal memory serves the individual alone, and it possesses all the same values and flaws. What do we mean by that? Well, let's look at what we mean by those flaws, but first of all, let's give a general definition of history. History is the study of change across time and place. Notice I say change. Very oftentimes we think that history is something static. We history majors, of course, tend to think that it is the most interesting thing on the world itself, in the earth itself. And we think that we hold some kind of special key to understanding life. To many other people, they regard history as perhaps unchanging, perhaps as static, and perhaps, God forbid, boring, right? But we know it's not boring because it's the study of change. It's the change that's constantly occurring around us and across both time and place. So there is not only a time element, chronological element, but there is one of geography as well. Now, civilization is humankind's attempt to bring stability and meaning to an uncertain and changing world. You know, the world can be a pretty scary place at times because it doesn't offer us really any certainties because things are constantly changing. But we have ways of making things better for ourselves. And one of those ways is civilization. Civilization which provides that kind of insurance policy that we need, that kind of stability and meaning that we need in what might otherwise be a kind of uncertain and changing world. Well, civilizations, societies, communities, and this is true for oftentimes people themselves, are generally are successful if they do these kinds of things. If they monitor their political and military conditions, and if their perceptions of those conditions are fairly accurate reflections of reality. If they're flexible in their response to changing conditions. If they recognize and reward successful leaders. If they learn from their mistakes. Now we can turn all of this on its head and say that unsuccessful civilizations would not do any of these things. In fact, they would not successfully monitor political and military conditions, or their perceptions of those conditions would be way out of touch with reality, that they would be inflexible or at least complacent in regard to changing conditions, that they would be governed by cliques and they wouldn't be open to new leadership, and that most importantly, they would not learn from their mistakes. Perceptions and realities are very important in history and really underscore everything we need to think about historiography, that is, about the history of writing history. Psychologists know that things are not always what they appear to be. So for instance, on this left-hand side, is this a picture of a silhouette of two individuals coming together, getting ready to kiss? There are their lips, there are their noses. Or is this simply a white goblet? Over here, what do we have? Do we have one, two, or perhaps even three pictures? Do we have an old man with his eyes here and this giant nose of his and a walrus mustache? Or do we have a young lady with her petite nose over here and her chin and her flowing hair and her beret and a fur around her neck? Or here, do we have the eyes of an old lady, the nose of an old lady and her chin? Which one is right? Mohandas Gandhi, the great leader of the independence of India, perhaps said it best. A man is but a product of his thoughts. What he thinks, that he becomes. When societies or even individuals, when reality doesn't match up with their perceptions of reality, it's kind of an unhealthy situation. On the other hand, the more closely that reality and perceptions of reality align, probably the healthier the individual and the healthier the society. Perceptions and reality are going to play vital parts in historians' effort to discover the truth and even to ask themselves if the truth itself can actually ever be found because of our changing perceptions. Kuyvik and Marty also state that as human society evolved, distorted memory and current belief repeatedly forged social myths, popular conceptions of past phenomena, independent of verification, but with strong, sometimes helpful, but more often baleful influences. History is an approach to understanding earlier times that diminishes the imperfections of memory and myth. Note it says diminishes the imperfections of memory and myth. It doesn't say erases or ends. That diminishes the imperfections of memory and myth. So what is historiography? We're not going to be spending a lot of time on historiography in this class. That is part of the overall course description. But because many of you have studied in more detail historiography in your History 389 class, that is Research and Writing in History, we're going to just kind of go quickly through historiography, look at it through a wider lens, a wider global lens this time, but let's just review some basic concepts, including what the definition of historiography is. Historiography is the history of the study of history. It hinges on the definition of history, which we already defined as the study of change across time and place. But that is a modern-day definition. It assumes that the past, the present, and the future are distinct. In ancient cultures and in some cultures in the world today, time was not so distinct, but it was more intertwined. It was seen as cyclical. This was true of the Greeks, especially the great philosopher Aristotle, who ranked history below philosophy and poetry. Well, we're going to look at four kind of overall views of history. So we're going to look at historiography from 30,000 feet up in the airplane. We're not taking the 300-foot view. We're not even taking the ground level view here. We're taking the 30,000 view. So let's look at the first of these. And this is mainly in ancient times. So this is a cyclical view. As we just said, this means people in ancient and even medieval times, and there are some people around today that still feel the same, the past, present, and future aren't really distinct. They're intertwined. This is more of a three-dimensional thinking pattern. There is not a clear distinction between fiction and nonfiction. I like to tell my students in History 489 and in History 689, if you ever go on for a graduate work like in public history, that if you walked into an ancient library like at Alexandria in Egypt, you wouldn't have seen a fiction section and a nonfiction section. You walk into a modern library today and there's clear delineation between fiction and nonfiction. And then we even have things like historical fiction. And then you have things like documentaries, which look at World War II and try to find the truth of World War II. But then you have things that we know are a mixture of fact and fiction. Things like, say, on World War II, The Sound of Music. It's a wonderful, right, musical, very much a family film dealing with some very deep issues, but in a kind of a playful way, and it's entertainment more than it is history. And you have science fiction and all kinds of other things that even in our own society begin to mix up. And we are able as people most of the time to go and understand what is fiction and what is not. And sometimes we have to do a little research to understand, for instance, that the Von Trapp family wasn't exactly like that film depicted. They certainly changed things around. Mrs. Von Trapp was not so carefree of a person from everything I've read as the movie depicts her, etc., etc. So we have these clear distinctions today in modern times between fiction and nonfiction, not so much in ancient medieval times, because their morality was the important issue. Mythology and historical reality could be combined together. People knew it, people understood it, it made things more interesting, you know. So look at the Iliad, right, by so-called Homer, which was orally transmitted for years, and it is about a real war, a real Trojan War that for a long time people didn't think happened. But archaeologists have discovered, yes, it did indeed happen, and they can identify when it happened in the Bronze Age. And they know it happened, but we know that across the course of the years there were many accretions and additions to make the story more entertaining. But in the end, there's a moral to it. And that was the important thing in ancient medieval times. So history was not really important to study because it could not be instructive of what was going to happen to, say, us. It was interesting and it was morally instructive, but it wasn't instructive in the sense of it can tell us where to necessarily move in the present and in the future. After all, the assumption was that things were cyclical, fate would have its role, and things would kind of go in a cycle. So if you believe that, you know, things occur in a cyclical fashion, then sometimes you don't have a great deal of control over the things that are happening. Although you can learn what things are moral and what things are immoral. The bigger question that philosophers of that time could not really talk about is how one could choose freely those moral or immoral things, or were you simply like Oedipus in the great tale, a product of fate? And even if you tried to escape that fate, that you couldn't. So the ancient Greeks, many tribal cultures, etc., focused more on fate and myth. Now, teleological. Teleological is linear. It's an idea where the past, present, and future are distinct. So it's more of a two-dimensional thinking pattern. And in this kind of thinking pattern, truths are believed can be known about the past. In fact, it's important to study the past because it outlines the progress and evolution of time. The assumption here, if you believe in a teleological kind of linear view of past, present, and future being distinct and things moving across time, is that the future will be better, just as the present is better than the past. So there's the past, and then there's the present, which is better, and the future, which will be better yet. This all kind of lies in its foundations in Judaism and in the kind of Jewish messianic views, you know, of themselves as the chosen people and of the Messiah that would come and things would be better. This is picked up by St. Augustine and by the medieval Christian church, which begins to focus on God and faith in history. And then by the time of the Renaissance, the focus begins to change on the impact and influence on humans in history. Then the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries come along, and people start searching for objective truths, laws of society, similar to laws of nature, the importance of progress. So you have all kinds of Whig historians of Britain, as they're called, like Thomas Babington Macaulay, believing in progress. Early kind of sociologists, quote unquote, like Auguste Comte, who were positivists, you know, believing in cause and effect and the importance of progress and of things getting better, of things progressing. And even in modern times, writers, authors, scholars like Rostow and Wallerstein are searching in modernization theories for these kind of universal events to explain things. All of these fall in that second kind of teleological category of historiography, of looking at history. Now, the third column is really something that emerges out of the German historians of the late 19th century, like Leopold von Ranke, who begin to look as the past, present, and future as distinct, but to say basically that the past is past. As von Ranke said, wie es eigentliche Wesen, as it actually happened. The past is past. Hence, the past is important to study on its own. It can be a help to understanding the present and how it came to be, but it is not there to push for an agenda for the future. Now, this is kind of the way that many historians my age were trained, that our mentors, that our teachers, our professors talked about the importance of trying to take the cultural baggage, the baggage that we all have of how we look at things, to strip that away and to go back and study the past without putting our own emotions and subjectivity on the past, but to study it in an objective fashion, to see the past for what it was, to read the documents and to let the documents speak to us with our subjectivity stripped away. And if the documents don't say what we would like to hear them say, because we're not supposed to hear that, if they tell us a completely different story, maybe even a story that goes against the very grain of how we thought what those documents were going to say before we read them, that is okay. The past is past. Wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it actually happened. Now, in modern times, especially in the 20th century, the late 20th century, there is this idea, and your textbook is going to go into much more detail on this, of postmodernism. That the past, present, and future are distinct, but the past is not really knowable because it is always subject to our own perceptions. It's important to study to realize our own biases, our perceptions, and the inequities of modern life, tracing their origins to biased cultural models. It's all relative. Things are relative. It's hard to find the truth. And this kind of relativism stems from relativity theory, the theory of relativity, and there's actually two theories of relativity. One's the universal theory of relativity from Albert Einstein. Another one in chemistry is Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You know, modern linguistics are heavily postmodern. New psychological and neurological findings are finding about things being uncertain, the truth not always being easily known. The ravages, the irrationality of World War I and of World War II, of the Holocaust, of decolonization, etc., have led people to believe that, you know, can we ever really learn from the past? Can we ever really understand the past? How is it? How could we possibly wrap ourselves around 6 million Jews and gays and gypsies being killed, 6 million plus, in the Holocaust? How can we ever understand that? That would be the way that a postmodern person would see that particular event. And maybe if they lived through it, or they heard it from their parents or their grandparents, as I did, then some of this believing that can we ever really wrap ourselves around that might make sense. Now, for what it's worth, my own view. Nothing in life is perfect. We can drive ourselves crazy trying to find the truth of any particular historical event or person. Or we could just simply satisfy ourselves knowing that we can know some of the truths of any particular historical event or person. We're not going to know all of them. We can't know all of them because we can't get inside people's heads to find out what those might be. Okay, sorry about the phone call interruption. So we're back. History can help us understand how we've come to be what we are and what some of the alternative paths might have been. In this way, I'm more a believer in historicism, but, because I live in the world I live in, I can see the points of view of all 4 different columns. In history, perceptions are a two-way street, so don't get run down. What do we mean by this? This is Wile E. Coyote from the old Warner Brothers cartoons, remember? And he was always after the Roadrunner, and the Roadrunner always outsmarted him. Always watch both ways. Wile E. Coyote never really watched both ways for traffic. By this we mean traffic going from the past to the present, and that moving from the present to the past. Don't assume that everything in the past can relate directly to the present, especially if there are centuries between you and the past. It may relate indirectly, however. And don't carry your own mental baggage into the past. For example, you and Christopher Columbus would think quite differently about many issues. And as my colleague Brian Hackett always tells his students, and I think this is brilliant, he said, if you could meet your great-great-grandparents, you probably wouldn't like them very much. And it's probably true because they really, assuming that most of us have never known our great-great-grandparents, because they've probably been deceased many years before we were born. But if you could really meet them, you would find out that the kinds of things that they thought would make them so different, kind of, from the way you are. Now, that's not to say they weren't good people or that they're bad people or anything like that. They're just different than the way we think. And they might have had some beliefs that we find absolutely horrifying. Now, in this class, another part of the class description says that we're going to do a large writing project, research and writing project. That's in the description. And so I want you to do an essay, and you're going to be working 14 of the 16 weeks of the semester towards completing that essay and getting that essay in. And I strongly encourage students to choose a topic that they find interesting because you're going to be living with it for 16 weeks. Or 14 of the 16 weeks. I only ask that the topic have a global dimension and be after 1750, because this History 489 is really supposed to concentrate more on global kind of issues and to be more modern. Beyond that, you have a choice. You can choose either to research and write a historiographical essay or a traditional one. I know that many of you have taken History 389, Research and Writing in History, and so you've already done a kind of historiographical essay. If that's the case, then you can do a traditional essay. And the differences between the two are here. A historiographical essay is really going to be concentrated on the history of the historians writing about that. So if you were going to do, say, for instance, the Civil War, you would look at the different ways the historians have viewed the Civil War, what caused the Civil War, what lasting effects did the Civil War have. So some historians might say, well, it clearly was about slavery, and other historians might say it was clearly economic. It was about two systems, an economic system in the North and one in the South that were increasingly diverging from one another, etc., etc. And then you would identify the schools of those thoughts, the issues involved, the schools of thoughts, etc. A traditional essay is going to take something, it's going to take something challenging, and it's going to try to explain it and explain how it happened. And obviously it has to deal with historians who have, uncovered some of the research and written about it, but it's not going to become fixated with those schools of thought. In fact, it might latch on to one school of thought more than others, and maybe, maybe if you were doing a difference between an historiographical essay on the Civil War is that to do it well, you would have to look at all those schools of thought. A traditional essay on, say, a cause of the Civil War might just look at an economic component, and it may just look at an economic component in a particular state or a particular region. Now, to make it really easy, this is how we're going to grade. This is the rubric that I'll use to grade your essay, either historiographical essay or traditional essay. So while you're writing this essay, you should have this in front of you and know that I'm expecting 20 double-spaced pages of text, not counting the title page or the bibliography. Now, it's a yes, no, or a partly thing. So either you have 20 pages or you don't have 20 pages, or maybe you partly have 20 pages. So if you have 20 pages or more, you get 20 points. If you've got 5, 10 pages, you get nothing in that category. If you've got like 17, 18 pages, yeah, I'll give you 10 points. No larger than 1-inch margins on all 4 sides, no larger than 12-point type. Introduction, at least one full paragraph that clearly states your thesis. Paragraphs using topic sentences. Good transition between paragraphs. Evidence supports thesis in a logical and organized manner. I somehow did not pick up this as a separate category. Conclusion, at least one full paragraph that restates or reviews your thesis. Use of in-text notes cited profitably, using a variety of sources. Bibliography, correct spelling, proper grammar, professional vocabulary, not repetitive. The use of synonyms to vary word choice, not I, my, me, not vulgar language. We can go through any of these that you want and any questions that you want to further clarify any of these particular points. Now, essay corrections. So there's really only one big version of your essay due, and it's worth 300 points, and it's due the 14th week. Now, let's say I'll grade those very quickly, and you're not pleased with your essay grade. Then on the 16th week, you can resubmit it with corrections made in order to regain up to 3/4 of your lost points. For example, if you received a 200 out of 300 on your essay, you could resubmit it, and provided you made all the necessary corrections, could have 3/4 of your lost 100 points. In this case, it would be 75. Add it back into your original essay grade. So rather than have, a rough draft and a final draft, we just have a draft. But that draft is correctable, and then I will go back manually if you get in the corrections and change your original grade. And this gives you some more instructions on what that includes and how to do that. I also have on the Blackboard in Word, in a downloadable Word document, how to use track changes in Word so that you can make the corrections. And basically, I grade all of my essays in Word, Microsoft Word, and I turn on a feature called Track Changes, which literally marks things up as I go through. So if I delete something and add something, you'll see it in red. And then you can also use Track Changes to accept or reject my changes one by one, and that's what that document shows you. Now, plagiarism. Every class we're required to tell you what plagiarism is. Please note that I'll be checking every essay for plagiarism, and if you commit plagiarism, you'll receive an automatic 0 for the assignment. Examples: quoting or using wording from a book, journal article, internet, or other source verbatim. That is word for word. And you do them without putting the quote in quotation marks and citing it in a footnote or an in-text note. Paraphrasing another person's unique idea, thesis, themes, without giving them credit in a footnote. For instance, if you're looking at, the causes of the Civil War, and you're quoting a particular work that someone, an historian has worked on for he worked on it his whole entire life and put it in a book form. And he had a very unique view of it, or she had a very unique view of it. Even if you're not putting it word for word, it wasn't your idea, and you need to kind of give that person credit in a note. Using another person's tables or graphs, using somebody else's paper or presentation, even if the student approves. Using paper or presentation from a free essay, a service, or paying for that. All of those constitute plagiarism. So, how do we avoid plagiarism? And what is plagiarism? Well, we can avoid plagiarism by going ahead and putting word for word, that is verbatim quotes, in quotation marks and footnoting them. Or in the case of this class, we're going to be putting them in in-text notes. So here I demonstrate how we have an entire paragraph, and I've taken a portion of that and I've put it word for word, so I need to put it in quotation marks, and either footnote it as you're going to do in some classes, or in text note it as you're going to do in this class. Now, let's say that you were going to use this whole darn thing, this whole entire paragraph, word for word. Then you need to do what is called a block quotation. And this explains what a block quotation is. You never really want to use many, if any, block quotations in your paper. They are not the way to go. Block quotation after block quotation makes it seem like you've had no original thoughts, that you really haven't done your research, that you really haven't thought about your research, and that you're just cutting and pasting an essay together, and none of it really is your own thoughts or your own words. But sometimes you might have to do that. And if you do have to do a block quotation, this is what they look like. Block quotations are single-spaced, they're indented, they're clearly footnoted, and everybody knows they're a block quotation. Now, sometimes you could take this and you could paraphrase what this has to say. So in the time, even if you paraphrase not generally known facts or statistics, you need a footnote or you need an in-text note. And the reason for that is, very few people in the world are like Sheldon on the Big Bang Theory and have that kind of photographic memory. In fact, some psychologists even question whether that sort of memory is possible. Let me just say this, in 30 plus years of teaching, I have never, ever met a single colleague or a student who has Sheldon's memory. Never happened, and I've met thousands. I've taught thousands of students and met thousands of colleagues, and some of them are very bright, but none of them have an eidetic memory. So you and I don't walk down the street and we don't know that China's population exploded from 143 million in 1741 to more than 400 million in the 1840s. You put that in, and somebody's going to say, where'd you get that from? Where'd you get it from? It needs a footnote or an in-text note, even if it's not direct quotation, verbatim, word for word. Now, you don't need to get fanatical about this stuff. You do not need to worry about footnoting or stuff that is widely known, widely disseminated, generally known. These are examples. Christopher Columbus sailed to America in 1492. Mother Teresa was a great humanitarian. President Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. The United States entered World War II officially after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. All widely known facts, all things that don't require a footnote. If you use someone's graph or illustration, you need to source it out. You need to put where the source of that is. Notice how they put the source there, and I've put the source of the source there. See how I've done that? So always you need to do that. Now, footnotes versus endnotes versus in-text notes or footnotes. Footnotes appear at the bottom or foot of a page. Endnotes appear at the end of a paper. For this class, we'll be using in-text notes, or sometimes called in-text footnotes. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to take the last name of the author of the book, the year of publication, put in a comma, and put in the page number, end the parentheses, it all goes in parentheses, and put a period. That is an in-text note. That's the kind of notes that we're going to be using in this class. I have a model historiographical essay online on the class website, so feel free to look at that. Now, one other thing that the paper is going to have is a bibliography, a list of your sources used. Given at the end of the paper, it gives the author's first and last names, the title of the book, the place of publication, blah, 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 all this stuff. And for this class, I want you to use what historians typically use. That is called Chicago style, also in a kind of simplified manner called Turabian style. Please consult your textbook, A Pocket Guide to Writing in History, for many examples of this. And if you have problems, you can also go directly to the citationmachine.net. And that will assist you in formatting your bibliographic references. Now, the question might be, where do you go for an additional source? What's trustworthy? For this class, we're going to avoid internet websites. I don't want you to go and look up internet articles. I want you to go to the databases in NKU Steele Library to find your articles through things like ProQuest, Academic Search Premier, Project Muse, etc. And I'm going to show you how to do that. I do not want you using Wikipedia. I don't want you using general encyclopedias like Britannica. Instead, we're going to rely upon standard scholarly sources, including the many digital, literally thousands of digital resources available at NKU Steele Library, and I'll show you how. First of all, when you go to the Steele Library, and this constantly is changing, they're always updating things, so this might not look exactly like this, but you're going to have to put in your username and password. And you can get to nku.edu through the quick links, or you can just go and drop down list, click Library Steele. Again, all of this kind of changes, but they're always there on the front page somewhere. And you can go to something called Research Help, Research Guides, and even things that take you exactly to history. Take you exactly to places like books, because there are many electronic books that you might consider using. For instance, we have a service called Credo Reference eBooks, so electronic books. Those are very useful. You have humanities ebooks, so that's another thing, that you might want to consider using if you're into electronic books. And there are half dozen ways you can search for journals through the W. Frank Steele Library, or you can go to a place that stores journals and will help you if you do a search, keyword search, for the kind of articles you're looking for. I'm going to talk about 4 of them today, but we're only going to go into detail about one of them, and that is JSTOR. And JSTOR is a service that the library buys. It costs a lot of money, so let's use it. And it's very helpful. JSTOR stands for JStorage. Now, if you do a kind of a search on JSTOR, let's say you're looking up the Habsburg Dynasty. And you can do sometimes very basic searches, or you can do some very advanced searches. Again, all of this constantly changes, so it may not look exactly like this. This is just to give you a general idea. But usually you can do things like this. You can put in like Habsburg Dynasty as your keywords. Then you might put in only content I can access, because you're really not interested in anything that you don't have access to. Normally you can even put in years of publication. You can tell them whether you're looking for research articles, whether you're looking for book reviews, etc. And you can even sometimes put in what area you want. And if it goes into history, it might even ask you what area of history. Well, after that simple search, I found over 2,200 items. Obviously, can't use them all for my research, say, if I'm doing the Habsburg Dynasty. Maybe I'm not interested at all in book reviews. Maybe I'm just interested in articles. You'll find out much more information about what's available, whether it's a journal, whether it's a book review. Do they have a PDF? Is it a PDF file that's downloadable? And in most cases, you're going to get the PDF files downloadable 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It might ask you the first time you download in any of these systems what your username and password is. It shouldn't continue to do that after the first time. The first time each session, obviously you close up your computer, you log off, next day you go back to JSTOR, you're going to have to go through the same process again. And normally these downloads, whether you're using JSTOR or Academic Search Premier or any number of other search engines to help you find articles, it's going to give you the full bibliographic citation. You want to make absolutely certain that you copy this because it's going to give you the author, the source, the volume number, the year, the pages, and that's very important to include in your bibliography. And you want all that stuff, right? Because I demand all that stuff. So there's a treasure trove of databases of search engines that will help you find what you need for this class. I am more than happy to meet with you. The library at Steely Library is always happy if you stop by. The reference librarians are there during a certain time of the day. They don't stay there late at night, but there are lots of people available to help you if you're having trouble with any of this, including me. And you just need to get a hold of me and set up a time. So JSTOR is something we looked at. There's also something called Academic Search Premier. That is a very good database. There's something called ProQuest. Excellent. Project Muse, which is actually a non-profit thing. Wonderful. These four, Academic Search Premier, JSTOR, and the two P's, ProQuest and Project Muse, are excellent. You really should experiment with these yourselves, become familiar with all four. And so that you can find decent stuff for your essays. So JSTOR, there it is under the J databases. Now, what happens if you're interested in finding a particular book? Let's say you're reading through an article that you found through JSTOR or ProQuest or something else, and in the notes, the footnotes, and this is the time, as you're taking 489, you should already be in the habit, and if not, to please get in the habit of looking at people's footnotes, saying, that's a really interesting article. He makes a very good point. It's a very solid point. I wonder where I can find out more information about that. And lo and behold, the person has in his or her article footnotes, bibliography, and you say, I want to read this book. Where can I find it? Well, if Steely Library doesn't have it, or your local public library, local university doesn't have it, one place to go find it is in one of these great big search engine databases which Steely Library subscribes to, called WorldCat, which stands for World Catalog. And here you can use the same kind of just general basic search or advanced search. This particular search that I'm showing you here was a basic search, and I've put in Encyclopedia Northern Kentucky, and I said that's the title of it, okay? And I want to find that, and I click search. The results in actually more libraries throughout the world have it than this now, but hundreds of libraries are showing up as having it. Now, depending on who cataloged this thing, we're getting different entries. Like 119 libraries cataloged it in this fashion, 2 of them in this fashion, 2 of them in this fashion. They're all the same book. Notice that NKU has the book, so you wouldn't have to go far to find it. But let's pretend that all the copies at NKU were already in circulation. So you actually can go from this, and you can go directly from these entries, and you click on the Encyclopedia of Northern Kentucky. It'll take you to a page where you can actually request through SourceFinder, and SourceFinder is NKU's interlibrary loan, to find another copy of the book for you. And so when you go in there, here it is, you'll find SourceFinder request. You hit that and it'll take you to the SourceFinder page. The SourceFinder page, if you've never used it before, it's going to ask you to set up an account. It's very easy to do. If you have used SourceFinder before, it's going to ask you for your username and password. Again, I'm always willing to help anyone understand any of the components of research and writing. That's what I'm here. That's what this course is designed for. Any questions, please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help. Have a really good week and a wonderful